I never imagined being told by my parents, who adore my genius sister, that I was no longer needed. Having one child is enough. We don't need a failure like you. Sandy needs a lot of money to bloom her talents, so if you can pay the monthly rent of $1,000, we might reconsider. My parents decided to kick me out of the house while I was still young. My uncle reached out to help me, unable to hide my confusion. Though I'm poor, if you don't mind, Emily, I'd really like to be your parent, he said. I immediately accepted his offer. My name is Emily. I am now 30 years old, but my life has a complex background. Before talking about my family environment, please listen to my story. I was born to a typical salaryman father and a stay-at-home mother. We lived with my grandparents in my father's family home, where my unmarried uncle also lived. I started living with my uncle when I was 4 years old. He was 24 at the time. Living at home at that age might not be so unusual. However, my uncle had special circumstances that kept him from leaving home. He had been frail since childhood and continued to have health problems as an adult, making it difficult for him to hold a steady job, so he ended up living a life of irregular part-time work. Working just a few hours a few days a week was not enough income to live on his own. Perhaps feeling inferior because he was dependent on his parents, my uncle always looked guilty. I frequently witnessed my father yelling at my uncle, "You really are a burden." Such incidents were limited to when my grandparents were not around. My grandparents loved both their healthy son and their frail son without discrimination. With decreased income due to the recession and being forced to live together, my father seemed to want to behave modestly in front of his parents. However, in places where they were absent, my father was always harsh, contemptuous, and mocking toward my uncle. Seeing this, my uncle would just look sad, never getting angry or talking back. "Why don't you get angry?" I once asked innocently as a child. With a puzzled look, my uncle replied, "Because I really am receiving support from my parents." As a child, I accepted that reasoning, but as an adult, I think my father is receiving the same support, so he has no right to criticize. If I had understood that at the time, I would have supported my uncle. Unable to grasp it as a child, I felt uncomfortable when my father raised his voice at my uncle but couldn't speak up. It's true that the atmosphere was peaceful when my grandparents were around. Under their watch, my uncle would smile gently, and my father would hide his emotions and behave accordingly. My mother was too busy caring for my young sister and me to pay attention to the relationship between my father and my uncle. As a child, I believed these days would last forever. However, our everyday life changed unexpectedly. My grandparents died in an accident. I was 6 years old at the time. My sister and I cried bitterly, overwhelmed by deep sadness and loneliness. I clearly remember my uncle also quietly shedding tears. But what I can't forget is my father's laughter. Yes, he was laughing. Despite the death of his own parents, he never cried. Not when we rushed to the hospital, not while preparing for the funeral. It wasn't just that he was composed, it was clear to me, even as a child, that my father was not grieving. And that conviction only grew stronger. On the day of the funeral, my father was laughing secretly, thinking no one was watching. I happened to see his face in a moment, and I clearly caught his expression. It wasn't a laugh born of sadness or confusion, but a smile of genuine joy, the kind of happiness I, as his daughter, recognized. My father was inwardly pleased with the death of my grandparents. He was probably considering various financial benefits. That smile was very unpleasant, and it felt terrifying to me as a child, making me cry. Perhaps it was taken as tears for the death of my grandparents. At that moment, my uncle put his hand on my shoulder and gently stroked it with a tender gesture. My eyes were red with tears, but my uncle's eyes, while filled with sadness, watched over me with warmth. Why was this so? Despite being blood brothers, my father and uncle had completely different reactions to our parents' death. At that time, my suspicions about my father deepened. Afterwards, my father's behavior changed significantly. His attitude towards my uncle became noticeably colder, and he would say things like, "Why should I have to take care of a useless person like you? You should be grateful just to be allowed to live here," he also said. "If you can't even pay rent, I should take all the inheritance," he declared. I didn't understand it at the time, but these statements were clearly unfair. Legally, the inheritance should be equally divided between siblings, but my father tried to monopolize it. My uncle had the strength to stand up to him and could have resorted to legal action if necessary. However, my uncle chose not to do so. While showing a saddened face, he didn't argue back or claim his share of the inheritance. Worried about my uncle, who seemed to have lost his will, I asked, "Are you okay?" To which he replied weakly, with a smile, "I'm frail and things aren't going well with my job, so it can't be helped." Day after day of verbal abuse from my father worsened my uncle's frail condition, leading to weight loss and a pale complexion. Despite this, my uncle always told me not to worry, smiling at me. However, 3 months after my grandparents passed away, my uncle was ultimately driven out of the house. "You're useless. Get out," my father said, and without saying or doing anything, my uncle left. "Uncle, don't go," I pleaded in despair, tugging at his arm, but he gently removed his hand from mine, placed it on my shoulder, and said, "Don't worry. Emily, you're strong, you'll be okay even without me." "But I'm worried about you," I replied. I was worried about my uncle, who was not healthy and couldn't hold a regular job, having to live on his own. As I looked at him with tears in my eyes, he said, "It's okay," and left. The farewell from my uncle was deeply saddening, but there was nothing a young child like me could do. Furthermore, I myself was soon in a situation where I couldn't afford to worry about others. 2 years after my grandparents passed away, the 8-year-old me was attending elementary school regularly, and my 6-year-old sister Sandy was about to enter elementary school as well. It all started when my mother mentioned that Sandy had been praised for being very smart in kindergarten. "This intelligence must definitely be inherited from me," my father exclaimed excitedly, and impulsively decided to have her take an IQ test. We were all astounded by the results. An IQ of 150. This is my DNA. The impressive number IQ 150 was displayed. Although I couldn't fully comprehend what made this so incredible, I understood that my sister was exceptionally gifted. "That's amazing, Sandy." He. "Thank you, big sis." When I casually praised her, she smiled joyfully. Those were truly happy times. But that was as good as it got. The developments that followed were the worst. "All right, let's have her take entrance exams," my father decided. So soon. My mother was surprised, but she was pushed by my father's unfounded confidence that if she's talented, it will be fine, and she got excited too. From then on, my sister began attending tutoring every day. Since my mother accompanied her, household chores were often neglected. As a result, the responsibility was shifted to me. "Since your mother and Sandy are busy, you'll take care of the house," I was commanded. Thus, doing laundry and cleaning became part of my daily routine. After school, I had no time to play. I had to go straight home and finish the chores, or I would be scolded by my parents. Days began to appear where I would skip meals because I hadn't done the chores. "You're a failure, we can't spare time for you," I was scolded. "Why can't you get perfect scores?" was a routine scolding from my father for my grades in the 90s. "Really, can't you be a bit more like your sister?" my mother said. Even if I scored high on tests or came out on top at sports day, my parents neither praised me nor paid attention to me. I was just continually ignored. "Be like your sister, Sandy," was like a mechanical repetition. Moreover, they would add condescending words such as, "It's impossible for you, but Sandy is a genius. You're just incompetent." Sandy indeed had talent, and she made remarkable progress in a short time at tutoring, quickly passing the entrance exams. As a result, my parents became even colder towards me. They spared no expense on Sandy. I couldn't get new clothes and had to make do with ones that had become too small. Sandy could enjoy delicious meals. I got leftovers. Sandy was taken on trips. I had to stay home and watch the house. My parents clearly favored only Sandy. "This child has a promising future. She'll secure our old age," my father boasted. Should we make her a doctor, or perhaps a lawyer? Becoming a politician wouldn't be bad either, my mother pondered. "We're really lucky to have such a talented daughter," my father said proudly. My existence went unnoticed by my parents, and me, crying behind Sandy, continued to be overlooked. Then, when I was 10 years old, my parents made a cold declaration. "One child is enough. We don't need a failure like you. Sandy needs a lot of money to bloom her talents, so if you can pay the monthly rent of $1,000, we might reconsider," they said. What I was bewildered. "We're saying that one child, Sandy, is enough," my father continued. "That's impossible. What am I supposed to do alone?" I said. "Why don't you try contacting your uncle for now? We'll give you some pocket money. Figure it out on your own," they said, handing me a little bit of money, and I was driven out of the house. I cried and banged on the front door, asking to be let back in, but there was no response. The door remained closed. In despair, I headed to the station. Even at the age of 10, I had the necessary knowledge and could take the train. I asked people for directions and finally arrived at the apartment where my uncle lived. When the bell rang, my uncle came out, showing the same kind face as always. He looked surprised but invited me inside, and when I explained the situation, my uncle showed his anger. "What are they doing?" my uncle exclaimed. I wasn't being scolded myself, but I was tormented by guilt for being forced out. Not knowing what to do next, tears welled up in my eyes. At that moment, as I looked down, my uncle gently placed his hand on my head. That hand, memorable for its size and warmth, was full of compassion. "It must have been hard, but don't worry anymore," my uncle said. "But what should I do now? As you see, I'm prone to illness and have little income, so I'm poor," my uncle said with a wry smile as he looked at me. Although we had lived apart for a while, my uncle's expression had grown much stronger than before. Perhaps there had been some change in his feelings due to the distance from my father. Looking directly at me, my uncle said with a smile, "I'm poor, but if you don't mind, Emily, I really want to be your parent. I'd like to become your foster father. I might not be very reliable, though." Before he finished speaking, I had already jumped into my uncle's broad chest. It was similar to my father's, yet entirely different. That chest gave me a great sense of security. "You don't have to worry about anything anymore." Hearing that, I cried with relief, and my uncle gently stroked my back, comforting me. It felt like he was treating me with the deep love of a real parent. After that, I was raised by my uncle. As my uncle was indeed poor and often ill, life with him was not straightforward. However, there were always smiles in our home, and the laughter that I had forgotten while living with my parents returned in abundance with my uncle. It was a poor yet warm household indeed. My uncle continued to give me boundless love. With deep gratitude in my heart, I lived each day to the fullest. Whenever I tried hard, my uncle always praised me. Even if the results weren't great, he valued the effort itself. Encouraged by this, I worked even harder. Gradually, I began to forget about my parents who had never praised me. I grew up healthy under my uncle's care, and before I knew it, 20 years had passed. I am now already 30 years old. And now, there is a familiar face in front of me. Dad, Mom. "It's been a while, Emily. Have you been well?" my father says with a smile, fading from my distant memories. My eyes, directed at my father, who has aged significantly and whose hair has thinned, show undisguised coldness. And for good reason. It's a "what do you want now" kind of situation. Unperturbed by my icy gaze, my father suggests, "Well, let's let bygones be bygones and get along as a family from now on." My reaction is predictable. What are you talking about? Get along as a family? You must be joking. Figures. A failure always has a bad attitude. Can't be helped. Maybe it's time to re-educate you. That's enough. Please go back home. I firmly stopped my father as he tried to enter the apartment. At that moment, my mother joined in, fueling the conflict. "Emily, don't be stubborn and accept our help. You surely can't be happy living in such a run-down apartment," my mother blurted out. You have nothing to do with this. Please leave. No need to be so haughty. Come on, let us in. No, just go home. Let us in. Go home. Even though they've aged, they pushed with more strength than I expected. Maybe it's because there were two of them, which made it hard for me to push back. We kept shoving each other like kids playing push and shove, but I managed to stay calm until the moment my father tried to step over the threshold. That's when I gave them a hard push back. Who? Ah. The force sent both my parents tumbling onto the ground, landing on their backsides. I ended up standing above them, looking down. Ugh, you're so annoying. What did you just say? I'm busy, so can you just leave already? What kind of way is that to talk? How do you even see us as your parents? I haven't considered you my parents since the moment you threw me away. But we took care of you until you were 10. Until 10, huh? If there's any time I can say I was actually taken care of, it was only when my grandparents were around. Yet you survived, didn't you? That doesn't give you the right to act all high and mighty. As they struggled to stand up while holding their backs, my parents looked much smaller. Even though they're in their 50s, they already seem like they're in their 60s or 70s. You're the ones who said it yourselves, didn't you? That Sandy was enough. With your genius daughter, there's no reason for you to come see me now. Well, it's not so simple anymore. At my words, my father grimaced and responded in an irritated tone. Did something happen to Sandy? What? Did she end up in need or something? She became a lawyer. Well then, there's no problem, right? That's amazing, just what you'd expect from someone with an IQ of 150. Oh, or so we thought, until she suddenly disappeared. That's quite surprising. As I listened further, it turned out that Sandy had successfully graduated from law school, went to grad school, took the bar exam, and although she didn't pass on her first try, she eventually did and became a fully licensed lawyer after her training. So why would she go missing after all that? She left a note saying, "I won't be taking care of you two," and then she just vanished. That's a tough situation. So in short, she's abandoned you. Congratulations. There's nothing to celebrate. That ungrateful child, after all we did to raise her, this is how she repays us. Well, I guess that's what happens when true love is lacking. While my parents may have showered my sister with excessive attention, it likely felt like nothing more than suffocating control to her. Parents who change their behavior based on an IQ score. Parents who burden their children with unrealistic expectations. Parents who disguise their selfish desires as affection. It's no wonder my sister grew fed up with that environment. Actually, the company went under. Well, given the times, that's not surprising. We barely got any severance pay, and the unemployment benefits are about to run out. That's great news. It's not great at all. It's hard enough trying to find a new job at our age. That sounds rough. Their obvious frustration only made me smirk with disinterest. That's why we want you to take care of us. The sudden demand wiped the smile off my face. No. What did you say? How can you just abandon your parents like that? The only real parent I have is my uncle, who has taken care of me since I was 10. What? My response left my father speechless. You knew I was living with my uncle when you came to this apartment, didn't you? So why are you acting surprised now? Do you really think of him as your father? My uncle, who gave me genuine love, is my true father. My words, which implied that parents who don't show love aren't parents, left my parents with stunned expressions. Even though he was sick and weak, my uncle still worked hard to support me. I wanted to repay his efforts, so I worked hard too. Wait, does that mean you actually have a proper job? Well, kind of. As I shrugged, my father suddenly grabbed my shoulder tightly. Let go of me. So, you're angry and a bit embarrassed too, aren't you? Please listen to what I'm saying. No need to listen. I understand it all. You were lonely, weren't you? You're sulking because only your sister got all the attention, right? But deep down, you're happy to see your parents, aren't you? Stop creating your own story. Don't worry, from now on, we'll be proper parents and stay by your side. I had no idea what he was talking about. Could it be that my father is already showing signs of dementia? For a moment, I stared blankly at my parents, and their ridiculous expressions made me burst out laughing. Why are you laughing? Is it because you're happy? Haha, not at all. Just so you know, in the past 10 years, I never once thought about either of you. Thanks to my uncle, I had a fulfilling life. As my parents stared at me in shock from my sudden laughter, I continued to speak. Actually, I received a scholarship to graduate from university. Oh, really? Then you must have gotten into a good company. Yes, I did. I got a job at a well-known big corporation. That's great to hear. And through an unexpected connection, I also got married. Oh, well, then I have to meet the groom and give my greetings. No, that won't be necessary. No, it's only proper that I should. That's impossible. He's currently overseas. Oh, I see. Wait, what? By the way, Uncle is also overseas. What? Your uncle too? I thought you were living here alone. I figured your sickly uncle had already. Don't go assuming my uncle is dead. He got a job assignment abroad, and since it's in a place with a good environment for his health, he went along. Now he's happily spending time playing with my kids. You have kids too. My parents were almost too stunned to process all the surprises I was throwing at them. With their bewilderment on full display, I smiled brightly. At first, Uncle wasn't keen on living together with us, but he eventually agreed. Now we're all living happily as one family. Well, in that case, we could move overseas too. Sure, go ahead. But we won't live together, and I won't be taking care of you. You're free to do what you want with your own money. That's impossible. Are you really going to abandon your parents? You're the ones who abandoned me first. My patience finally snapped at their selfish demands. My parents' faces turned pale. I have no gratitude toward you for anything, but I owe a great deal to my uncle. From now on, I intend to repay him for all he's done for me. That may be so, but at least send us a little money, please." Uncle never touched the money I sent him and continued to live in this old apartment the whole time. But now, he's finally agreed to leave here and live with us overseas. I'm just here to finalize the paperwork. What? On the very last day of leaving this shabby apartment, the fact that you two show up, what a coincidence. Wait, what? You're leaving. The process is already done. I'm just returning the keys and then I'll head back to our home overseas. What about us? Are you just going to leave your mother and me behind? My father asked in shock, and I nodded clearly. Thank you for abandoning me. I said that with a smile, leaving them speechless. Truly thank you. Because of you, I'm happy now. With those words, I walked past them. How does it feel to be abandoned by the daughter you once threw away? I asked one last time, but there was no response. Without waiting for an answer, I left. It felt like this was the final goodbye to my real parents. After that, I returned to my home overseas. Throughout my life with Uncle, I worked hard and persevered. That effort paid off, and I secured a job at a reputable company. Later, I got an opportunity to work abroad, and it was there that I met the man I married. Uncle shed tears of joy as he celebrated our union. Soon we had children, and we invited Uncle to join us, and now we're all happily living together as a family. My husband, our children, and of course Uncle too. And I hope I can meet someone wonderful like you did, Big Sis said, my sister, who stood beside me, smiling as she watched the kids play in the garden. Don't worry, you'll find someone great. You're finally free from our parents' control, I reassured her with a smile. That being said, I really need to get used to this new job, my sister said. Why not try getting a law license in this country, I suggested. I'm not interested in being a lawyer. I've had enough of doing what our parents wanted. I want to take on a job that I truly want to do, she replied. You're right, I agreed. Right after our parents abandoned me, a letter from my sister arrived at my uncle's house. In it, she described how she was suffering under the excessive expectations and pressure from our parents. After discussing it with my uncle, we secretly arranged to meet my sister on her way home from school. We kept in touch without our parents knowing. My sister wanted to live with us, but with my uncle's financial situation, it was impossible for him to support both of us. More than that, our parents would never allow it, so my sister endured living with them until she became an adult and could plan her escape. It was a tough ordeal, but she overcame it and finally gained her freedom. While our parents were distracted, celebrating her success as a lawyer, she moved out and became independent. Of course, I was there to help her. Although she secured a job here, she's struggling to adapt to the new language and environment, but I'm sure she'll be fine. There's no one more resilient and hardworking than my sister, who withstood the strict upbringing of our parents, so she'll adapt quickly. On the other hand, although I was worried about Uncle said he's planning to attend a language school, I told her, and she nodded with a smile. That's great. It's never too late to learn. His health has improved a lot, so we should enjoy life more now. You're absolutely right. Our parents quickly ran out of money after they selfishly squandered the inheritance. Even though they continued to invest in my sister, they eventually lost their jobs. When they sold the house, they were left with very little, as it was tied up with home improvement loans. They've been asking relatives for financial help, but everyone has responded coldly, leaving them to live in poverty. I heard from a relative that arguments between them are constant. I believe there should never be favoritism between siblings or unfair treatment of one's children, I said, reflecting on the past. You're absolutely right. Once again, my sister nodded in agreement with my words. No matter what happens, I'll always be here to support you, Sandy. You've already done more than enough. Thank you so much, big sis. Seeing how much my sister had grown brought tears to my eyes at that moment. What do you mean by support? Suddenly, I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. It felt slightly smaller than before, but still warm. I turned around, squinting as I smiled. Thank you. Huh? As I turned, I saw my uncle standing there, looking surprised at my words. I smiled warmly and said, "Thank you, Dad. I love you."